The main square of that nameless town in the Balkans was like the geography of a wound. History in these lands had not been a gentle teacher. On the contrary, it was a cruel executioner that had left bullet marks on the walls of the buildings and bitter memories passed down through generations in the hearts of the people. On that day, that square was witnessing the bleeding of one of those old wounds. On one side stood the cold and uncompromising barricade of the United Nations peacekeeping force, woven with steel and Kevlar. Behind the barricade, young soldiers in their 20s, their faces shining with sweat and tension, were tightly gripping their modern rifles. For them, this town was just a dot on a map, an item on their mission list. On the other side was a crowd flowing like an angry river toward that barricade. Hundreds of civilians, old women, angry young men, worried fathers. What brought them together was a town leader they believed had been unjustly arrested the night before. For them, this square was not a piece of geography, but their home, their honor, and their quest for justice. Between the two sides there was a gap of only 30 meters, but a gap as deep and dangerous as a chasm. And the person trying to fill this gap with technology was Lieutenant Miles Powell. Miles was a brilliant and ambitious officer, a recent graduate of the military academy in his late 20s. He specialized in psychological warfare, or psyops. He believed in controlling crowds, not with traditional methods, but with modern science. For him, this angry crowd was an equation with variables that had to be solved. And in his hand, he had the newest formula to solve this equation. The giant black loudspeakers mounted on an armored vehicle behind the barricade were spewing that formula onto the square. It was not music. It was not an announcement. It was a physically disturbing, nauseating noise, a mixture of frequencies too low for the human ear to hear and too high for the brain to bear. This sound was one of the newest weapons of modern psychological warfare. According to the books, this sound was supposed to break the concentration of a crowd, to make them restless and eventually force them to disperse. But the books had not taken into account the stubborn spirit of a town in the Balkans. The inhuman sound emanating from the loudspeakers was not scaring the crowd. On the contrary, it was enraging them even more. It was an insult to their pain, to their quest for justice. This noise was denying their existence, their humanity. And they were responding to this denial with more anger. In the rearmost part of the barricade, in the bed of a truck, was another group of men, watching what was happening with concern. They were wearing old ceremonial military band uniforms. They were the United Nations Peacekeeping Force Band, or rather what was left of it. Most of them were musicians in the autumn of their careers, counting the days to their retirement. They were brought to missions like this only as a morale element, to play at flag ceremonies or official visits. In this new technological face of war, their brass wind instruments were like antiques. The band's conductor, Richard Goldblum, in his 60s, was rubbing his old silver-colored trumpet, a deep sorrow on his face. He wasn't looking at the young lieutenant's shiny, expensive loudspeakers. He was looking at the crowd itself. He wasn't seeing a mob, a threat. He was seeing a giant choir that had lost its rhythm, that had gone out of tune, that was screaming in pain. Under every slogan there was a fear. Behind every clenched fist, a desperation. Miles Powell, on the other hand, was frustrated that his created equation was not producing the expected result. "Increase the volume," he shouted into his radio. "Widen the frequency range." But as the volume increased, the anger of the crowd also increased. And then the expected, the feared moment came. A young man from the crowd tore a cobblestone from the ground and threw it with all his might toward the barricade. The stone hit the shield of a soldier with a dull thud. This was the first drop. Then a rain of stones began. The soldiers took refuge behind their shields. The order, "Shield wall," echoed from the radios. Miles was drenched in sweat. He knew what the next step was. tear gas, plastic bullets. And this, in this town where the delicate balance was hanging by a thread, could be the beginning of a massacre. His technological solution had lit the fuse of a disaster. He was getting constant announcements from the command center to get the situation under control. He was on the verge of losing control completely. In that darkest, most desperate moment, he felt a hand on his shoulder. When he turned around, he saw the band conductor, Richard Goldblum, in front of him.
"Let me, Lieutenant," the old man said, his voice calm and determined despite the hellish noise around them. "Turn off that hell machine. Let our boys play a piece." Miles couldn't believe what he was hearing. He stared at the old man's calm face. This was madness. "What?" he shouted. "The band? What are you saying, Chief? This is not a circus show. We're in the middle of a riot." "That's why," Goldblum insisted. "The stones they're throwing are not from hatred, but from fear and from not being understood. Your noise is feeding their fear. It's alienating them even more. Stop shouting at them. Let's give them something they know, something they're familiar with. Let's give them a melody that belongs to these lands." Miles hesitated for a moment. This was against everything he had learned at the military academy. This was where logic ended. But then he thought of the sound of the stones hitting the barricade, the tense faces of his soldiers, the disaster that was getting closer. He had nothing left to lose. His own methods had already gone bankrupt. He reached for his radio. He gave the hardest order of his life. "Tell the PSYOPS vehicle to cut the sound completely." The unnerving, inhuman sound that was filling the square was suddenly cut off. This sudden silence was more surprising than the explosion itself. The crowd paused for a moment. The hands that were throwing stones remained in the air. Everyone was looking toward the barricade as if trying to understand the reason for this unexpected change. And into that silence, the soft, melancholic, and incredibly familiar melody of a single trumpet began to seep in. Richard Goldblum had brought his trumpet to his lips and was playing with his eyes closed. What he was playing was not a military march. He was interpreting one of the oldest, most well-known folk songs of the region, in a melancholic tone, almost like a lullaby. It was the song of wars, of famines, and of losses. It was a melody that their grandmothers had sung to them as children. After the trumpet, slowly, the other instruments also joined in. The soulful sound of an old accordion, the weeping tone of a clarinet. The band began to play that simple, familiar melody with all their souls. Over the square, it was as if a magic was happening. The notes of the music were slowly melting the anger, the hatred, and the fear that was hanging in the tense air. The angry slogans in the crowd gave way to a surprised silence. The young men who were throwing stones slowly lowered their hands with a bewildered expression, not knowing what to do. The old, headscarfed women in the front rows of the crowd burst into tears when they recognized the melody. This was the sound of their childhood, of their lost homes, of those old, peaceful days. They slowly began to hum the melancholic melody. The music was building a bridge between the two sides of the barricade in a way that words and weapons never could. It was taking them out of being soldiers and protesters and was turning them into people of the same land, who had tasted the same pain, who had grown up with the same songs. When the song was over, the deadly, sharp tension in the square was no longer there. In its place was a heavy, thoughtful silence, brought by a shared sorrow and an understanding. The crowd had not dispersed, but it had been transformed. It was no longer an angry mob, but a grieving community. And from within that community, the leader of the most angry young men, the one who had started the protest, slowly took a step forward. He opened his hands to his sides, not as if saying, "I surrender," but as if saying, "We can talk." A dialogue had begun. A massacre had been averted. Later, after everything had calmed down and a negotiation process had begun between the parties, Miles went to Richard Goldblum, who was packing up the instruments of his band. The young officer was still under the influence of the miracle he had witnessed. "This," he stammered, "this wasn't written in any of the books I read, in any of the psychology manuals." Goldblum replied while carefully placing his trumpet in its old velvet-lined case. "Because the books write how to control a crowd, but they don't write how to touch the soul of a people." He paused and looked at Miles. "Music is the common language of the soul, and you were just shouting at them in a language they didn't understand with noise." On that day, Miles learned that the most effective psychological operation sometimes comes not from the most powerful loudspeaker, but from the most familiar, the most human melody. And as a leader, he learned that his duty was not to silence people, but to listen to them and to find a way to be able to sing the same song with them. For more stories like this that tell of how even the fiercest anger can be soothed by the right melody, don't forget to subscribe to Unspoken Code Stories.